Today on Theology Thursday, we're asking the question, how we can be shrewd but not rude. And we're going to be looking at a really weird passage as we do that. Let's dive in. So we're looking at Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9, and it's this parable that, like some of Jesus's parables are kind of just bizarre. This one is really bizarre. It kind of sounds like Jesus is advocating for fraud, which is interesting. He's not actually, and we'll get into it, but we're going to be considering this passage under the heading of how we can be wise with what God has given to us, make the best use of it, and not be punks in the process. And so let's read this text and we'll get into it. The passage begins in chapter 16, verse 1, but if you remember right, chapter 15, the end of it, it's this parable of the prodigal son, this son who received an early inheritance from his father, and then he squandered it, just wasted it on wild living. Well, here we have a different person who is squandering resources that he's been given. The passage begins with Jesus telling his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. And so he called him in and he asked him, and by the way, that wasting, it's the same word that's used earlier in chapter 15 for the son who wasted his inheritance. Anyways, the guy, he gets called in by the master of the property and he says, what's this I hear about you? Better give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. And the manager says to himself, well, shoot, what shall I do now? My master has taken away my job and I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. You know, if my meal ticket's running out, I better go find a new meal ticket. And so he called in each one of his master's debtors. This guy, he was probably in charge of collection, and he maybe paid some of his own salary off of the interest that he was collecting on these people. Anyways, he calls these people in and he asks the first one, how much do you owe my master? And of course, this guy knows. But the person says, 900 gallons of olive oil. And the manager told him, all right, take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 450. Cuts it in half. And then he asks the second person, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. And he told him, take your bill and make it 800. And that's fraud, okay? That's this guy doing what he is not supposed to be doing, right? Let's just be clear on that. Then the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. He acted in his own best interest, okay, in a cold, calculating manner. For the people of this world, and this is Jesus talking still, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So Jesus is advocating for fraud. Interesting.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
He's not. We'll just read on a little bit, because context is kind of important. Jesus goes on, he says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little also will be dishonest with much. And so if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. Now, there's a lot in this passage that we can't really get into, but I want to just kind of break this down for you because there's a lot of difference between our culture and the culture that this was written in. And that's where some of the confusion in this parable comes. Like Jesus isn't advocating for fraud, and he isn't advocating for you like to blackmail people or to buy friends or like to buy your way into heaven. We'll get to that in a little bit. Instead, Jesus is just kind of drawing a general point from this parable. And I want you to just kind of take this parable and break it up into like thought units. In the first part, you have a manager who is wasteful. He has squandered what he's been given. And the parable begins with Jesus talking to the disciples, but we know that the Pharisees are overhearing. Think back to chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Jesus is hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, and the Pharisees are really ticked about it. And that's all going on, and then Jesus tells these parables, right? The Pharisees are listening in. And earlier on in the Gospel of Luke, we've seen all these cases where Jesus is kind of just roundly condemning the Pharisees, the teachers of religious law, and saying like all these things basically amounting to you were given a high calling and you done messed up. You've screwed up so much. And this ministry is being taken from you. That's kind of like bigger context of Luke. And so like you have in this parable, this wasteful manager, and then the context where Jesus is telling this parable of these wasteful, these squandering Pharisees and teachers of religious law. And then the problem in the parable is this manager is trying to figure out a new meal ticket. His meal ticket is being taken away because he was dumb with his job. And the context here that Jesus is eventually getting at is, Pharisees, you've had a meal ticket, you've had a role and a responsibility, but that is being taken away from you because you done messed up. And the parable is resolved, at least for the dishonest manager, by him working with the master's debtors, kind of getting in good with them by using his own cunning and deceit to establish residence for him once his employment is gone. And it's not that the guy is being righteous, that he's doing something good, or that God approves of blackmail or anything like that. It's just that he made lemonade out of lemons. That's how the parable is resolved. And that's just the basic point. He used what he had available to him to get what he needed. The people that Jesus is saying this parable to are these Pharisees who need to shrewdly provide for themselves, although not in the same way that this dishonest manager did, but in a more godly, honoring way. They are, though, to take what they have available to them and to use it to get a new home for themselves. Their meal ticket's running out, and they need to, instead of just sitting on their hands and doing things the way that they've been doing, they need to listen to Jesus. They need to recognize the signs of the times, get their acts together, because their meal ticket's running out. And so the message to the Pharisees, and by extension to us, is we better make sure that we get ourselves a friend in a high place who can invite us into his eternal home. That's the message. Use what you have to get what you don't have. That's the general message. And we take it beyond that. We get into some really weird things. Again, Jesus is not advocating fraud. Look everywhere else for evidence of that. He isn't advocating for you to buy your way into heaven. Again, look everywhere else and you see that you can't do that. He's just saying, use what you got to get what you don't got, but what you need. You need to be shrewd. You need to care for yourself in that way, which leads us to the question we're considering today. How can we be shrewd but not rude? Like, how can we be people who are looking out for our best interest eternally, but not punks about it? How can we be sharp but not harsh? Keen but not mean? Bold but not cold? Prudent but not rudent? Anyways, I'll stop. Here's how. I want you to think of the Pharisees and Jesus' interactions with them, because that's really important. Again, so often he is getting after them for their cold and harsh behaviors because of how they had grown to protect themselves and guarded themselves in their positions. You know, they accumulated all kinds of wealth and prestige and power. They loved when people would look up to them. And whenever they felt a threat to those things, they would lash out and they would try to protect them. At least that's what Jesus says about them. The Christian, on the other hand, recognizes that all of these things that God gives to us are indeed gifts, but they aren't permanent gifts. Like if God gives you a family, your family is going to die one day. You're going to die. God gives you wealth. That wealth is going to waste away and inflation's going to go up and you're not even going to be able to use it. God gives you all these things, but we know that they don't last. We're realistic about it. The comforts that God has given to us right now are for right now, and they're temporary. And so we are told that we ought to be willing to give them up, because whether we're willing to give them up or not, they will be taken from us. I'm reminded of a passage a few chapters earlier in Luke where Jesus says to a number of anxious people, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. So sell your possessions, give to the poor, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And I think of that because of this passage in verse 13. Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. We take the two together. Your treasure is either going to be God or it is going to be money, or whatever other thing here. You cannot serve two masters. And wherever your heart is, that is your treasure. So if you are seeking after and you're desiring to protect at all costs your power, your prestige, your finances, your whatever, that is your treasure, and you'll do anything to keep it. And that's the shrewdness that leads to that rudeness that we're trying to avoid here. When you're trying to hold on to all these earthly things, it gives itself to that dog-eat-dog sort of mentality. But the Christian is called to give those things up so that he can get something that you can't get in this life. And the message there is less of the, hey, become poor so that you can earn yourself treasure in heaven. And it's more, listen, if your heart is tied up in those things, like it was for the Pharisees, they heard all of this and they were sneering at Jesus. They said, no, actually inside I love that money and it makes me secure. The Christian hears this and says, listen, if our heart is tied up in these things, if those things are making it so that we can't pursue the treasure that we have in heaven waiting for us, let us get rid of that treasure that we have in this life. Let's get rid of anything that is getting in the way of the real thing that we need. This prudent action that Jesus is calling us to is less about building up the typical things that end up making us rude or crude and cold toward others. And it's more about giving those things up. It's about using what we have available to us to make sure that we don't reject this really great friend that we have in heaven, who is inviting us into his eternal home. We'll talk more about that on Sunday, so I invite you to come on out, tune in to hear more about that. Now, next Theology Thursday, we are back in chapter 16, and we are taking the next parable that comes up there, and it is an absolute doozy. It has a lot of richness to it and a lot of questions that come up about hell surrounding that passage. So that should be a hell of a time. I'm not sure if I can say that, but guess I did. Anyways, that's what we're talking about next week on Theology Thursday. Until then, God bless you. See you next time.